they were looking at the advantage. And the good news, at least based on the research that these people did, Raj Chetty, Nathaniel Hendren, Patrick Klein, and Emmanuel Saez, is that we may have reached a status quo, at least for the last 20 years, in terms of upward mobility. Now, that probably comes as a surprise to most of our listeners because we've been hearing nonstop about income inequality. We've been hearing nonstop about a stagnant employment picture where lots of people just can't get a job. We've been hearing about graduates of colleges and even doctoral programs who can't find a foothold into employment. And yet these people, based on looking at thousands of tax records, say based on the study, the overall picture hasn't changed much in 20 years. I know you've had a chance to at least glance at this research. What was your take off it initially?
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating because it's a good news, bad news kind of report. The good news is, in spite of growing inequality, which is demonstrable, which is there in the numbers, and despite that increase in inequality, economic inequality, there has not been a decrease in economic mobility. And that's the good news. You know, a lot of folks say, wow, that's kind of counterintuitive. That's surprising, pleasantly surprising, because you might think it would go the other way. There's something called the Gatsby effect, you know, that predicted that as social inequality increases, especially economic inequality, mobility will decrease. Well, this is good news on the one hand. On the other hand, Andrew, and I hate to be someone who focuses on the part of the glass that is half empty all the time, but on the other hand, it tells us that we do still have a casino economy in which the birth lottery determines your chances of future success. Upward mobility for people in the bottom quintile, the study said, if you're in the bottom quintile, you have an 8% chance of getting into the top quintile. On the other hand, if you're born into the top quintile or into the next to top quintile, you have a much greater than 8% chance, you know, covering around 50, 60, 70% chance of winding up again in the top quartile or quintile. So it suggests that the birth lottery is all important, that what family you happen to be born into determines your future prospects, not with iron determinism, but greatly increases your likelihood of success. And many people might say, I thought that the American experiment was about getting rid of inherited privilege. And this is a form of inherited class privilege, that kids who are born into richer families have better life prospects than kids born into poorer families, even though you can't distinguish between the two groups of kids on the basis of their deserts.
It's interesting that you use the casino analogy because one of the statistics I think makes sense. If you go to Vegas, if you go to Atlantic City, if you go to any kind of casino, every so often people are like, well, it's important that I sit in the correct seat because there's a lucky seat. And if I'm in the lucky seat, the chips are going to come to me. Well, it turns out, according to this story, if you are born into the correct seat, say if you were born in Charlotte versus San Jose, you're much more likely to be upwardly mobile, even though overall, if we look at the general means, the numbers haven't changed.
Yes, it makes much of success and failure look like a crapshoot, doesn't it? What region of the country you happen to be born into, what family socioeconomic situation you happen to be born into, what school district you happen to be born into. And so all of these forces of just contingency and luck and chance undermine, you know, any real claim that what we have is an economy that rewards the hardworking and punishes those who don't work hard. You can work hard, but if you're from a family in the wrong region of the country or in the wrong quintile economically, your prospects are just much dimmer than the same kid born in a family in a higher quintile. So yeah, it brings home, Andrew, in a lot of ways, how much luck rather than pluck determines social outcomes in the economy, the casino economy we call the American way of life.
I want to also ask you about a potential outlier effect because when I was reading the abstracts and a little bit of the discussion of the study, it seemed to me that the rate of change between the bottom quintile and the topmost quintile has not changed. But I didn't hear a lot of mention about the amount of change between, say, the bottom and the next bottom, or the bottom to the middle, or the middle to upper middle, or the gradual shifts that you might see. And I'm wondering if what we're seeing is, well, there's still a certain number of people, forgive the choice, who are going from the inner city to the NFL or becoming rap stars or becoming music stars. You know, so you're still getting that very small people who are making the giant jump. But how many people are actually generally moving upwards may be a different picture.
Yeah, and it really brings home, Andrew, I like your example of you can point to certain entertainers, certain athletes, and even people like Obama and myself. You can say there are people who are from the lowest quintile. Certainly I was, and some of the people you mentioned, the athletes, were from the lowest quintile, and they rose to the top quintile in this economy, so it can't be that bad, can it? The problem is that you'll always have lottery winners. Because someone wins a lottery, if I win the state lottery tomorrow, it doesn't mean that that's a good investment strategy for other people in the ahead of me, but for other blacks or low income people or any other people, period, to invest a lot of money in trying to win the state lottery. You can have occasional winners. That doesn't prove that these chances aren't long, that the deck is in a way stacked against the poor and truly disadvantaged folks. And so my worry is that, yeah, we will hold up the people who are lottery winners as proof of the legitimacy and rationality of the system, when really we should be questioning the casino approach to success and failure in the first place, number one. And number two, say, if we're going to have a casino economy, let's say we're going to do it this way, then we at least have to have a lot of social support and safety nets for people who don't hit the jackpot and fall off. We can't let them go splat without any safety net when they fall from the dizzying heights of this casino economy that we're trying to erect.
Now, between 1971 and 1986, the researchers were looking at intergenerational mobility based on the correlation between parent and child income percentile ranks, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
However, when they were looking at years closer, when it doesn't make sense that the child is still a child or the child is just entering college, if they're entering college, they decided to measure mobility as the correlation between a child's probability of attending college and her parents' or his parents' income rank. And I'm wondering if that latter would be a very problematic variable and that you would see a lot of validation risks in that.
Oh yes, there are those risks, but there's also the reality. You're right to point out the risk, the validation risk, Andrew. But there's also the reality that the better college or school you go to, the better your life chances. That's what it's trying to suggest, right, and identify. And the fact of the matter is that if you go to an Ivy League school or a school with a great reputation, you do have a better chance than if you go to school, that just started up or doesn't have a very good reputation. The problem is that just shows how perpetuating the current kind of way of doing things is, because you look at a school like mine around the corner from me, Crenshaw High School, it lost its accreditation in 2006, 2005. Those kids have no chance to go to an Ivy League school. They have no chance to go to any good college because the high school they're graduating from lost accreditation. It's an unaccredited high school. So I can believe that kids who go to better schools have better life chances. And if you come from a richer family, you go to a better school. My concern is what that means about all the kids we're relegating to failure because they're going to crumbling schools in inner city neighborhoods.
In fact, they say the high mobility areas have five things in common. First, less residential segregation. Two, less income inequality. Three, better primary schools. Four, greater social capital. And
Yeah.
five, greater family stability.
Yes.
And so that seems to be the recipe for increased mobility. And I would imagine that has also not changed over the last 20 years or perhaps even longer.
Yeah, it's held pretty constant. That's one of the things that the study found, that even though there's been quite an increase in economic inequality, it's mostly been at the top end. It's the tail end at the top that has been the real asymptotic rise in inequality. That the middle class America is still roughly as economically unequal as it was 20 years ago. There hasn't been a great increase in economic inequality within the American middle class, and for that reason, there hasn't been a real plummet in social mobility, even though there's been this increase in economic inequality. If there was an increase in economic inequality in the middle class, then we're going to see a plummet in social mobility, say the economists.
And is 20 years a fair window to look at this issue?
Yeah, that's a good question too. You know, how we're chunkifying time, Andrew, how we're trying to zero in on what relevant periods of time to identify patterns and trends. 20 years, is a good place to start, I suppose. We need to expand it. Of course, we need to go back 50 years to the Great Society program, see what kind of impact they had, to the Nixon years when they tried enterprise zones, to the Reagan years when they tried trickle-down economics, and into the Clinton years when they tried different kinds of economic approaches as well. We need a broader time frame of database so we can really try to trace what kinds of changes in policy can affect the socioeconomic mobility of people within the population.
One of the most important things about any research is not necessarily the results found, but the questions generated. So I'll probably want to end with this. When you've looked at this study, and I suspect you'll look at it deeper as we move forward, what are the questions that come up in your mind that you would like to research, or you would hope that they would like to research going forward?
Well, one is the good news, because we talk about so much bad news, but the good news in this is that there hasn't been a dip in mobility, which means that a lot of kids that people were wringing their hands about, 10 years ago, what are they going to do? Are they going to go out and get jobs? They've gone out and found jobs, and they have roughly the same mobility as their parents. So that's the good news. I hope that this will also, though, focus our attention on inherited privilege, economic class privilege as a form of inherited privilege that we as a democratic country want to look at very carefully. We made race, accidents of birth based on race illegitimate as basis of privilege. We all recognize that there's something wrong with that. We need to extend that analysis to all forms of inherited privilege, class being one of the big ones, and ask why a kid who comes from Beverly Hills should, just because he was born to those parents, have so much rosier a picture for his future than a kid from right around the corner from me, South Central LA. That's, I hope, the question that these kind of studies will focus our attention on.
Looking at the state of the American dream and how upwardly mobile American society is today, as well as 20 years ago. I'm Andrew Hiller for Radio VR in Washington, and I've been joined by Professor Jody Armour. He is a professor of law at the University of Southern California. Thank you so much.
Great being with you, Andrew.